Hey, welcome back to Nick Vic Locks. Tonight we're talking about binding order, key biddings, and other stuff that does not matter. So when I was searching through YouTube and different things, starting out trying to learn the basics or learn anything and everything I possibly could, I came across some different videos that talked about mastering the binding order, how to learn the binding order of the pins. You need to know this to improve, and it's going to help you. And I can tell you now, honestly, doesn't make a bit of difference whether you know it or not. Doesn't matter. Same thing with the key bidding. And you'll hear a lot of people say, sometimes serious, sometimes half joking, bidding doesn't matter until it does. But so we're going to talk about that stuff. Binding order. What is the binding order? So the binding order is when we're picking the lock and we tension it, which pins bind when. You know, you're not always going to have a lock and tension it up and be able to pick straight down the stack where it'll bind 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or if you're starting in the back, 6 to 1, or count that as 1. However, it's not always going to be that way. You know, you're going to maybe 1 will bind, and then 4 will bind, then 3, then 6, 5, and then 2 binds last. So if we grab a lock and we go to pick it for the first time, we don't know what the binding order is. So the first time we get that lock open, we did it without knowing the binding order. So learning the binding order, trying to figure that out, is only going to help you on subsequent picks of that lock or attempts on it. But the first time you pick the lock, it doesn't really matter. And there's a lot of things that can play into that. So this lock here is an ASA 600, with gins, 6-pin lock. And because of those gin pins, depending on what the key bidding is, which we'll talk about here in a minute, the pins are going to change their binding order. You'll have an initial binding order, and then as we get things set into that counter milling on this, it may change to what pins are binding after that, in what order you need to pick them in. Think about it in 2 stages. You're picking to the milling, and then you're picking out of the milling. And the binding order for those 2 are going to be different. Depending on what security pins are in the lock, the binding order is going to change too. If you have spools and serrated drivers, depending on the bidding and where the drivers are sitting at the shear line, more than likely the serrated pins, because they have a larger diameter, are going to bind before the spool pins. So that's going to play a factor in the binding order. And depending on where they are in the lock and the tolerances, all of that's going to factor together to create a binding order. And that also is what allows us to pick the locks. If everything was machined to 100% perfection, then we wouldn't be able to pick them. It's those variations in tolerances and slight changes, plus or minus, half a millimeter or smaller, that are going to make the difference in the locks and our ability to pick them. Higher tolerances, harder to pick lock, along with any modifications made to the core and the driver pins and key pins to thwart us from being able to open it. And then the direction we tension is going to factor into it as well. So if I'm tensioning clockwise, my binding order is going to be different than if I tension counterclockwise. And that really comes down to the tolerances within the lock. We might have pin 1 here is going to be slightly off to the right-hand side, pin 2 a little less, but still to the right, 3 to the left, 4, say that one's dead center, 5 slightly to the left, and 6 slightly to the right. So if I'm tensioning clockwise, those pins that are slightly off to the left-hand side are going to bind before those ones that are to the right. And then vice versa, if we tension counterclockwise, any chambers that are offset somewhat to the right with the variances allowed in the machining process are going to bind before those that are offset to the left side. But so the imperfections that allow us to pick the lock affect the binding order, or have the other way around if you want to think of it like that. Then you can get into things like tapered pins. Tapered pins are going to drastically change and affect how the pins bind in what order, because as we're picking them, where that taper is going to narrow down into the shear line between the plug chamber and the Bible chamber for that stack. And they're going to move slightly as we pick it and tension the lock. Things are going to go up, may fall down some. So it's going to be a lot of whack-a-mole and bouncing between them. And if you're spending all of your time in the lock bouncing between different pins, the binding order doesn't matter in that regard, because you're bouncing between them all. And then the other thing is, if you're picking a lock and trying to learn and memorize the binding order, that comes down to learning to pick a lock or this lock as opposed to picking locks. So there's an ASSA 600 with gens. This is a 700 with gens. I can learn to pick the ASSA 600. I can learn to pick this ASSA 600, memorize the binding order, be able to open this real quick, have no issues with it, know it inside and out, but that doesn't help me necessarily with other ASSA 600s, apart from learning how the gens are going to interact and feel. But it's going to take me significantly longer if I get another 600 and try to pick that compared to this one. Whereas if I learn to pick the lock, learn my pin states and the feedback that I get from it, that's going to be applicable to all of the locks I pick. And binding order is not necessarily going to matter because I'm paying more attention to the feedback the lock is giving me as I'm picking it. So that's my thoughts on the binding order. When it comes to the key biddings, we'll zoom in here on this. You'll have a lot of people say that they've got a good key bidding or a bad key bidding. That kind of comes down to the lock itself or the picker's preference. You know, a lot of people typically or generally will say a good bidding is one that has a lot of variation between the pins, or is pushing as close to the MAC, or its MAC, or maximum adjacent cut allowable within that key and pinning system. So I know on Schleg, I think it's 6. That's a MAC of 6. So you can have a 1 and a 7 next to each other because they're 6 apart, but you can't have a 1 and a 9 next to each other. It won't allow the key to work. So when you get into like lockout keys and harpoon keys, things like that. So if we look at the key bidding though, if we have all super low cuts that don't get a whole lot of lift, it's not necessarily a fun lock for us to pick. And we would kind of say that's some bad bidding on that one. Granted though, if you're trying to pick a more difficult lock and you're just wanting to get that open for a belt video or something else, and you get a lock that has like this Sergeant, a lot of key cuts that are pretty close together, uniform, you might be like, oh, sweet, that's a good bidding because it's going to be easier for you to open up. But if you can't deal with the security pins or the other factors within the lock, the bidding doesn't really matter if you can't pick it, if you don't know what you're doing or how to listen to the lock and see what it's telling you. So this lock, we've got some low cuts and some high cuts. If I look at it here, I can see here in stack 3, I've got that high cut, and same thing here in 6. Now, what's interesting about this one is if we have going from 6 to 1, high, low, lower, and then again, high, low, and lower. So setting these pins in 3 and 6, trying to lift those up depending on the profile I'm using, may cause me to overset the stacks here in 4 and 1. And that's kind of where the bidding comes into play. The bidding is going to allow you to look at it and get an idea of what type of hook you're going to need to work around that. So if I come in here on 1, we're going to say the bottom of the key is the bottom of the keyway. They'll be on top of each other there. And that's where my pick is going to be resting in the lock anyway. Or if we're going to be picking from somewhere else, we can match that up with the key and say, okay, this cut here matches this warding. That cut there is going to line up, or that warding is lining up with this cut. So if I'm picking off of that warding here, get that in frame a little bit better. If I'm picking off of the warding here, I can use this groove here as a bottom and say, okay, if I go in, can I move my pick up to set whatever pin that is for the height on the key cut without necessarily crossing or lifting this one? Now, get pretty close here. So this would probably work for that. And then if I come in, pin 6, again, it gets real close, but it'd probably work fine and not worry about oversetting for 1 in those regards. But if I came in with a lower cut hook, trying to get in here, think about not coming below that line, trying to set it, I'm raising up above pin 1's bottom of the key cut here, so I'm probably going to overlift that one when trying to set 3. So we might come in and say, well, let's get a steeper hook. And this one, if I come in just right on that warding, pin 3 will be at shear just by touching the pin, and we're not even hitting pin 1. Same thing here on 6. Raise that up. No issues with your interactions with the other pins in the lock. So the key bitting can be good to know and look at or play a factor in your pick selection, unless you're picking a lock blind. So there are instances where you're going to get a lock. You may buy it off of eBay. Somebody may send it to you as a loaner. You could pick it up from another picker, and it doesn't have a key. So you don't know what the key bitting is, in which case you're picking it blind. You're just going in, and you have to decide. You're going to start out with, most people are going to start with a short hook. That's a better short hook. And try to work on it. And then depending on what they're feeling and what the lock is saying as they're picking it, what the pin feedback is giving you, you may decide, okay, I need a steeper hook. I need a shorter hook for some of these lower lifts or high lifts. And then you're going to adjust accordingly and grab a different tool and keep working on the lock. Which then, using the key bitting or picking a lock without a key, goes back to the same thing with the binding order is, are we learning to pick this lock or are we learning to pick locks in general? So paying attention to that binding order, or not paying attention to the binding order, paying attention to the feedback that you're getting as you're going through the lock, as well as how your pick is interacting with the warding or working around the other pins to make a decision on if you need to switch to a different pick, if what you have is fine. Do you need to slow down and focus and actually pay attention, to what the lock is saying and what you're feeling with the feedback? Working on the jiggle test, or what different pins feel like as you're pushing them up. Does it feel springy? Does it feel mushy? Are you getting the solid click from when it's setting? Falsets and counter rotation, all kinds of things. The speed bumps that I've talked about in other videos, all of those factoring together are going to give you all the information you need to pick a lock and render knowing what the key bitting is or knowing what the binding order is irrelevant. So the other thing is too, if you get challenge locks, the keys are usually going to be in a mummy or in a sleeve or wrapped up separate from the lock. And you typically, rule of thumb, courtesy, etiquette, is to not look at the key until you've picked the lock. You're also not going to gut the lock unless you've picked it open. But you're going to have that key somewhere else to be out of the way. You're not going to know what the bidding is. You don't know what the pins are. So you're picking it truly blind. You're going in and you are only able to make decisions off of what feedback you're able to get from the lock. So being able to detect the pin states, feel what's going on, pay attention to it, know what that feedback actually means and how the pins are moving within the lock, building that mental image of what's occurring. That's what we should be focusing on and dedicating ourselves to, as opposed to learning the binding order of a particular lock and the pins. So that's just my 2 cents on the matter. This is a challenge lock I'll be making. I hate me too. But you can listen to me, not listen to me. Like Bruce Lee said, that you listen to what people have to tell you, take what is applicable, and throw away the rest, or ignore the rest. I kind of do that with a lot of things anyway, but applies to this as well. Was there anything else I had to do? Nope. That was it. Oh, yeah. So should you learn the binding order of a lock? Are you wanting to pick locks and just be a better picker? Then no. You want to do speed picks and pick a particular lock as fast as you can? Or you want to make your video easier to watch, shorter, or less cumbersome when you're submitting for a belt? Go ahead, learn the binding order. Pick that thing open. Get it as quick as you can, as clean as you can. Make it nice and pretty. Then yeah, learn the binding order. If you just want to pick locks, don't worry about the binding order. The key bidding, are you starting out and you're a newer picker or less experienced and you're wanting to get all the help you can to help you make decisions and get that lock open? Look at the key bidding. Learn it. Let it help you. Let it guide you. Use that as a base for your pick selection, different things like that, for paying attention to, okay, well, I know the key bidding is, let me grab this one, pretty low. So when I go into the lock, my pick doesn't need to go up all that much in terms of the angle on it. On those high lifts, it definitely needs to go to a steeper angle. Use that. Let it help you. And then you're taking the information from the key. You're using that to help adjust your picking style. But then you want to pay attention to, okay, I know I need to lift it higher and my angle is going to be steeper on my pick. I'm going to pay attention to what feedback I get from that. I'm going to listen. I'm going to feel for that click for when it gets set. If I lift it higher than that angle, I know it's overset. What does that feel like? Okay, that's what the overset pin feels like in this lock. Let me reset, start over, use that knowledge for my next attempt. I know if I feel that, I've overset it. So everything up until that point, it is either underset or set. You know, if you progressive pin a lock and you're down to 1 or 2 pins in it, you set the first pin and you go, okay, what does the set pin feel like in this lock? Feels like that. Okay, great. Use that and go from there. And you're basing that off of information you got from the key. So yeah, if you're beginning, starting out, learning, take every advantage you can. Use the key to help you make decisions and then learn the feedback that you're getting from those things. And then as you progress, you won't need that information. You'll just have it. You'll know it as soon as you feel it. So, but that's my 2 cents in the matter. This is helpful to somebody, hopefully. I think it would have been helpful to me. It's kind of what I do in the videos, but nobody told you. You matter. You're important, and I'm glad you're here. You all have a good night. And
Juno, you want to subscribe?